Wounded 3 times. 2 bullets penetrated his left arm. One hit about 3 inches below the shoulder and caught the bone square and shattered it. A second bullet went through the forearm, hitting near the elbow and passing 5.5 inches through the forearm until it came out near the wrist. A third bullet wound up probably deflecting off a tree first, losing some of its velocity, caught him in the palm of his right hand. It went through the thinnest part of the entire anatomy, but it was the only bullet that stayed inside the body, trapped in the backside of the hand. It was a fairly inconsequential wound. It was easily extracted. They put a splint on his hand and that was taken care of. But the left arm was in such bad shape that they had no other recourse but to amputate it. So they took off the left arm about 1 inch above the highest wound, just 2 inches below the shoulder. Almost immediately after that, Jackson was evacuated to here. That meant putting him in an ambulance and carting him 27 miles over back roads to this point. A 15-hour epic journey just so that they could link up with the railroad outside. As quiet as Guinea Station is today, in 1863 this was one of the busiest places in all the Upper Confederacy. This was the supply base for Robert E. Lee's army. So everything that fed, armed, and equipped the army was brought by rail to this point and disseminated to the front by wagons. Correspondingly, everything leaving the army, all the sick, the wounded, the prisoners, the dead, all of them are going to be coming through that same conduit. And so there is a thriving metropolis here of tented city, anywhere from 7,000 to 22,000 troops around us at any given time. It was anything but quiet around Guinea at that point. Jackson is here to link up with the railroad so that they can evacuate him to the hospitals in Richmond. Unfortunately, the idea of the trip collapses. And that's because Union cavalry had slipped behind Confederate lines and cut this railroad at Ashland, halfway between us and Richmond. As a result, nothing was getting in or out of Guinea Station, no exceptions. And Jackson, like everybody else, was trapped here. They started setting up temporary field hospitals around us. Officers filled the houses of the area. Jackson wound up having to improvise and take over a little outbuilding or office on Fairfield Plantation, this building. This was never designed as a house. This was designed merely as a workspace. Normally it would have been furnished with nothing but workbenches and tools. But they quickly rearranged the whole building just to accommodate Jackson. Once they brought Jackson in that door, at 8 p.m. on the evening of May 4th, he never left this building alive. They put him in a room down at the foot of the stairs.
That's the railroad, isn't it?
That is the railroad outside.
Is it over here?
It's right here.
Okay.
Right. It's just that the door is open, so the sound is coming at you. Now, first couple days Jackson was here, he did remarkably well. His strength came back very quickly. He showed a tremendous resilience. He was healing at an ideal rate, according to Dr. Hunter McGuire, his medical director. He became very talkative. He did not tire. He showed great stamina. After 2 solid days of improvement, Jackson even started badgering the doctor about how soon he could return to active duty. That's a good sign. More good news arrived when they realized that the damage to the railroad was negligible. It was easily repaired. Trains would be out and in operation on May 7th. Jackson could easily be evacuated at that point. Dr. McGuire was so content with Jackson's recovery that on the evening of the 6th, he did something unusual. He went to bed. He had put off sleep for 4 solid days from the moment Jackson had been wounded till that point. But as the danger passes, the crisis abates, the doctor could go to sleep. Now, history has a rather ironic sense of timing, because it's that night that everything changed. At 1 a.m., Jackson woke up violently ill here. He became intensely nauseated. He had trouble breathing. He suffered from severe pains in his side and a very high fever. When McGuire was awakened, he diagnosed Jackson as suffering from pleuropneumonia. Pleurisy and pneumonia. There was no cure for either one in 1863. McGuire didn't accept that. In fact, he started bringing in doctors left and right to help him work with Jackson. By the end of the week, there were 5 doctors working with Jackson, including civilian specialists in pneumonia, sent for from Richmond. More importantly, Mrs. Jackson was able to come up here and be with her husband. She had been in Richmond when informed her husband was wounded. Her immediate impulse was to come and join him. She had to wait till May 7th for the trains. She was on the first train to Guinea, and she arrived just hours after her husband collapsed. She walked into such a crisis, she literally stayed in the room with him and helped minister to him over the last 3 days of his life. For those 3 days, Jackson was a tremendously erratic patient. There were times when he was dangerously close to a coma. Other moments, he'd be very lucid, very sharp, easy to talk to, and then he would slip into delirium and start shouting commands as if he was back out on the battlefield. He would lapse in and out of this cycle repeatedly. Nobody knew how Jackson was truly faring, not until the final day. May 10th, 1863 was a quiet Sunday in the camps surrounding Guinea Station. At that point, the doctors examined Jackson very early and then repaired to a room behind the stairs and came to the agreement that Jackson was beyond their help. He was showing the worst symptom yet, and that was exhaustion. He didn't have the energy to survive the crisis, and in fact, his body was already shutting down. When they realized this, none of the doctors wanted to tell Jackson. Over the last several days, all of the doctors had hinted to Jackson that this could be a fatal event, and Jackson had been rather provoked by such talk. He was adamant against it. On the last day, nobody wanted to upset Jackson. Instead, they ushered Mrs. Jackson out of here and on the front porch informed her that her husband would not survive the day. Mrs. Jackson saw things differently. She thought that it was absolutely vital that her husband know. So she took it upon herself to break the news. And she handled it in a magnificent fashion. She actually knelt beside her husband's bed and broke the news by posing it as a question. She asked if it was the will of your heavenly Father to be with him this day, would you acquiesce? She had to repeat the question several times before Jackson was roused from a stupor, and then he eventually answered in a very weak voice, I'd prefer it. Later on, Jackson confronted Dr. McGuire, point blank saying, Anna tells me I'm to die this day. Is that so? Confronted with it, the doctor became very forthright, and the thing that astounded him was Jackson's reaction. Where he had been so provoked by such talk earlier, now he completely relaxed. In fact, he smiled at everyone in the room, and all he said was simply, good. That's good. It's all right. In that instant, Jackson not only understood, but accepted, and perhaps we should make the case embraced the end. About an hour, maybe an hour and a half before the end, Stonewall Jackson slipped into delirium and did not come back. He started to ramble quite a bit, talking very freely, sometimes barely audible, other times just booming at the top of his lungs. According to the staff officers and the doctors and even Mrs. Jackson, he was literally reliving the last 2 years of his life, and they could pick out distinct moments based off of what he was saying here. Anything from a simple dinner conversation with the mess to evening prayers with staff officers, quiet moments with Mrs. Jackson. But all the scenes came back to Chancellorsville. And at those points, Jackson would become extremely animated. He'd start shouting out commands that could have easily been heard through the entire building as he called for General A.P. Hill to press forward Hill, cut them off, pass the infantry to the fore. He was calling on various staff officers. Some of these young men were right beside his bed, like his chief of staff, Sandy Pendleton. He called on him repeatedly. Have Pendleton see to it. Have Pendleton take care of that. At one point he became upset. Where is Pendleton? Pendleton, I want you to see if there's any high ground between us and the river. Now as he worked his way through a litany of staff officers, Jackson started thrusting himself up out of the bed in an upward fetal position. It was agonizing to look at, and Dr. McGuire admitted, at this point it became unbearable to watch his friend die. Dr. McGuire walked out of this room and left his patient with the other doctors. As Jackson continued to call for staff officer after staff officer, he got to his commissary officer, Wells Hawks. As he shouted out, tell Major Hawks to... He suddenly stopped, right in mid-sentence, and he just completely transformed. He relaxed. He sank into his bed. He was quiet for a moment, and then startled everyone by smiling. According to a witness, it was a smile of ineffable sweetness. And in a very light voice, Jackson whispered, let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees. And then he was gone. Stonewall Jackson died in this little room at the foot of the stairs.